The little girl's question stopped every voice in the yard. But why did the frightened bride look as if answering it might cost her everything? The suitcase slipped from Naomi's trembling hand, hitting the porch with a dull thud. Wind rushed through the cottonwood leaves as a 6-year-old girl hugged a faded cloth rabbit and whispered, "Can you be Mama?" Luke stood frozen, his fingers tightening around the gate, while Naomi couldn't force herself to take one more step toward the house. What held her back was something neither of them could yet see. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and join us for more unforgettable Western love stories. Late summer settled over Arizona territory with a hard, golden light that made every stretch of red earth shimmer beneath the sun. Beyond the rocky ridges of the Mogollon Rim, the wagon road into Dry Mesa lay quiet except for the distant whistle of the morning train. Luke Harper stood alone on the platform, his hat pulled low against the glare. Dust clung to his boots, and one leather glove rested on the rail beside him. He had arrived almost an hour early. Waiting was easier than thinking. Around him, townsfolk pretended to mind their own business. A ranch hand leaned against the water tower. Mrs. Edith Collins straightened folded fabric inside her sewing shop, but kept glancing through the window. 2 men outside the cafe paused halfway through their coffee. Everyone had heard the same story. The widowed cowboy from Cedar Wash Ranch had ordered himself a bride. The train slowed with a long hiss of steam. Iron wheels groaned against the track before the cars settled into place. Passengers stepped down one after another. A family with 3 children, a traveling salesman carrying sample cases, an elderly preacher returning from Prescott. Luke searched every face, uncertain what he expected to find. Then he saw her. A young black woman stepped carefully onto the platform, carrying a weathered brown suitcase whose corners had been stitched more than once. Her dress was simple, faded blue beneath a tan traveling coat. She paused before taking another step, her eyes moving across the station, never resting in one place for long. It was the look of someone who had learned to notice every exit before entering a room. Luke removed his hat. "Miss Brooks?" She looked toward him. "Naomi Brooks." Her voice was calm, though her fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. "I'm Luke Harper." For a moment, neither moved. Then Luke crossed the distance, reached for the suitcase, and waited. Naomi hesitated only a second before letting go. "Thank you." It was all she said. Neither noticed the whispers beginning behind them. They don't even know each other. "Poor little girl, I wonder how long she'll stay." Luke heard every word. He kept walking. His wagon waited beside the hitching rail, a pair of bay horses flicking their tails against the flies. He secured the suitcase behind the seat before helping Naomi climb aboard. She accepted his hand without looking directly at him. The road home wound through miles of open country. Juniper trees dotted the hillsides. Dry creek beds cut across the land like pale scars. Now and then, a jackrabbit darted through the brush before disappearing among the rocks. The silence between them stretched naturally. Luke finally cleared his throat. "The ranch is about 12 miles. Naomi nodded. "I see. There isn't much of a town out there. I wasn't expecting one." Again, silence. The wagon wheels rolled over packed dirt while the afternoon breeze carried the smell of sage and warm cedar. Luke glanced toward her only once. Naomi sat with both hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't admiring the scenery. She watched every passing ridge as though memorizing the road back. By the time Cedar Wash Ranch came into view, the sun had begun to drift lower. The cabin stood beneath 2 old cottonwood trees. A split-rail fence enclosed a small corral where 3 horses lifted their heads. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney. Luke slowed the wagon. "We're here." Naomi climbed down carefully. She looked at the house, then at the porch, then at the open doorway. She didn't move. Luke waited beside the wagon. "If you'd like, you can come inside." She swallowed. The cabin looked peaceful enough. Fresh-cut firewood stacked beside the wall, a rocking chair, a tin bucket catching rainwater beneath the eaves. Nothing dangerous. Still, her feet refused to carry her forward. Luke didn't urge her. He simply stood beside the horses, giving her all the time she needed. The screen door creaked. A little girl stepped onto the porch. She hugged a worn cloth rabbit missing one button eye. Her light brown hair had slipped loose from its braid. She looked first at her father, then at the stranger standing outside the gate. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The wind stirred dust across the yard. Somewhere beyond the barn, a windmill turned with a slow metallic squeak. The little girl walked down the porch steps until she stood only a few feet away. She studied Naomi with complete seriousness. Then, in the smallest voice imaginable, she asked, "Can you be Mama?" The words seemed to stop the afternoon itself. Naomi's breath caught. Her eyes widened before quickly lowering toward the child. Luke stood frozen. Grace had never asked another woman that question. Not once. The little girl waited patiently, still clutching the old rabbit against her chest. Naomi opened her mouth. No words came. Only the quiet sound of the wind moving through the cottonwood leaves. For the first time in a very long while, the empty yard no longer felt completely empty. Naomi looked down at Grace. The little girl still held the worn cloth rabbit against her chest, waiting for an answer with the simple patience only children seemed to possess. Naomi lowered herself until they were nearly the same height. "I don't know if I can," she said softly, "but I'd like to be your friend." Grace considered those words with surprising care. Then she gave a small nod, as if that answer was enough for today. Luke let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. He picked up Naomi's suitcase and stepped toward the porch. "Come on inside." This time she followed. The cabin smelled faintly of pine boards, black coffee, and the cast-iron stove that still held the day's warmth. Everything was neat. Every chair stood exactly where it belonged. A calendar from the general store hung beside the kitchen shelf, still turned to August. A pair of polished boots rested beneath the window. Nothing looked neglected. Nothing looked lived in either. Luke carried the suitcase to a small room off the hallway. "My wife used this room for sewing." His voice stayed even. "I never changed much." The room held a narrow bed covered with a handmade quilt. A treadle sewing machine stood beside the window, a folded measuring tape still resting across it. A wooden basket contained neatly stacked pieces of fabric that time had faded, but never disturbed. Naomi ran her fingertips lightly across the quilt. "You kept everything." Luke looked toward the window instead of at her. It didn't seem right to throw it away. Neither spoke after that. At supper, Luke served venison stew, fresh biscuits, and coffee. Grace drank milk from a blue enamel cup with a chipped rim. The little girl watched Naomi more than she ate. When Naomi reached for the butter, Grace quietly slid it closer before being asked. It was such a small gesture that Luke almost missed it. After the meal, Naomi gathered the bowls without saying anything. "You don't have to," Luke said. "I know." She continued washing them anyway. Water splashed softly into the basin. Outside, the evening breeze rattled the windmill. Later, Grace appeared in Naomi's doorway carrying a brush. "My braid came loose." Naomi smiled gently. "Would you like me to fix it?" Grace climbed onto the edge of the bed without another word. Naomi worked slowly, separating each strand with careful fingers. "My mama braided it before church," Grace whispered. Naomi paused only for a heartbeat. "I'll do my best." When the braid was finished, Grace reached up to touch it. "It feels nice." She smiled. It was the first smile Luke had seen from his daughter in weeks. He had been walking past the hallway when he stopped outside the half-open door. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched for another moment before quietly walking away. A few days later, Naomi rode into Dry Mesa with Luke for supplies. The clerk at the feed store greeted Luke by name. Mrs. Edith Collins stood arranging bolts of fabric outside her sewing shop. Naomi stepped forward with a few coins folded carefully inside her glove. "I'd like 2 yards of plain cotton." Mrs. Collins glanced at her, then at Luke. "I'm afraid I've already promised that bolt to someone else." The shelves behind her held plenty of cloth. Naomi noticed. So did Luke. She simply nodded. "I understand." She turned without another word. Across the street, an older rancher sitting outside the barber shop called after her. "Miss." Old Ben Carter rose slowly from his chair, leaning on a weathered walking stick. "My late wife always kept extra cloth." He tipped his hat. "If you don't mind second choice, you're welcome to take some." Naomi looked surprised. "I couldn't accept that." "You can." His eyes crinkled kindly. "Grace ought to have a new dress before Sunday." Luke watched the exchange without speaking. On the ride home, the bundle of folded fabric rested quietly beside Naomi. "Mr. Carter seems like a good man," she said. "He is." Luke adjusted the reins. He remembers what kindness costs. That night, the desert air turned unexpectedly cool. Near midnight, Luke woke to the sound of hurried footsteps. Grace's bedroom door stood open. Naomi knelt beside the little girl's bed with a damp cloth resting across her forehead. A kettle simmered gently on the stove. Wild mint and willow bark steeped inside a tin cup. Grace stirred uneasily. Naomi whispered something too softly for Luke to hear. She brushed loose hair away from the child's face and replaced the cool cloth with another. "You've been awake all night," Luke said quietly. Naomi never looked up. "She has a fever, I'll stay." She shook her head. "You need your strength for morning chores." Luke hesitated. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He trusted someone else. When dawn finally colored the eastern sky, he returned to Grace's room. The fever had broken. Morning light spilled through the curtains. Grace slept peacefully, curled against Naomi with the cloth rabbit tucked between them. Naomi had fallen asleep sitting upright against the headboard, one arm still wrapped gently around the child. Luke stood silently in the doorway. He remembered restless nights after his wife's passing, Grace crying until sunrise. Nothing he tried had ever brought her this kind of peace. He quietly pulled the bedroom door almost closed. Then he walked outside with his coffee cup, stopping on the porch as the first sunlight reached the cottonwood trees. For the first time in years, hope arrived without making a sound. Autumn settled over Dry Mesa one cool morning at a time. The cottonwoods along the creek turned pale gold, and wagons from distant ranches began rolling toward town for the annual harvest fair. Fresh apples filled wooden crates outside the general store. Children chased one another between hitching posts while fiddles warmed up near the dance platform. Grace had been talking about the fair for days. Luke brushed the dust from the wagon seat before helping her climb aboard. Naomi adjusted Grace's newly sewn blue dress, smoothing one loose sleeve with gentle fingers. The fabric old Ben had given her fit the little girl perfectly. "You made me look pretty," Grace whispered. "You already were," Naomi answered. Luke heard the exchange as he gathered the reins. A small smile almost reached his face before disappearing beneath the brim of his hat. The road into town felt different now. Grace sat between them instead of alone. Every so often her small hand reached for Naomi's without thinking. Naomi never pulled away. By late morning, the streets of Dry Mesa were alive with music, horses, and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the cafe. Luke tied the wagon outside the feed store. "Stay close," he told Grace. "I will." The little girl nodded eagerly before wandering only a few steps toward a table where carved wooden toys were displayed. Naomi watched her carefully. Then a horse stopped across the street. Its rider dismounted slowly. Tall, well-dressed, black hat, expensive boots polished despite the dusty road. Several people nearby fell quiet the moment they recognized him. Silas Boone, owner of the largest cattle operation in the county. He looked directly at Naomi. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Recognition passed between them before a single word was spoken. "So," Silas said at last, his voice calm enough to draw attention. "I finally found you." Naomi's shoulders stiffened. Luke noticed. He stepped beside her without asking questions. "You know this man?" Naomi answered quietly. "I hoped I would never see him again." Silas walked closer, removing one leather glove. "You left Missouri without saying goodbye." "I left because I chose to." His smile never reached his eyes. "That's not how I remember it." People nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Mrs. Edith Collins stood frozen in her shop doorway. Old Ben, across the street, slowly rose from the bench outside the barber shop. Grace hurried back and wrapped both arms around Naomi's waist. Silas reached inside his coat. Instead of a weapon, he removed several folded papers tied together with faded ribbon. "I've been looking for my fiancée." Naomi lowered her eyes. "I was never your fiancée. You were promised." He unfolded the papers one by one. "Your guardian accepted payment. There are signatures." A murmur spread through the crowd. Luke glanced at the documents but did not reach for them. Silas held them high enough for curious eyes to see the old ink and official seals. "According to these," he continued, "Naomi Brooks belongs with me." Grace squeezed Naomi tighter. The little girl's face disappeared against her skirt. Luke stepped forward until he stood between Silas and the two of them. His voice remained quiet, steady. "No one belongs to another person." Silas laughed once. "You must be Luke Harper." "I am. I suggest you stay out of business that doesn't concern you." Luke met his gaze without blinking. "It concerns me now." Silas folded the papers carefully and slipped them back into his coat. "You've built yourself a comfortable little story." He looked past Luke toward Naomi. "It won't last." Then he spoke loudly enough for everyone gathered around the square to hear. "I'll recover what's mine. If the law won't do it—" He paused. "Another way will." The words hung over the street long after he turned and walked toward his horse. No one spoke. Even the fiddle music had stopped. Marshal Owen Briggs watched from outside the jailhouse, his expression unreadable. Silas mounted his horse and rode away without another glance. Only after the hoofbeats faded did the town begin breathing again. Luke turned toward Naomi. "You don't owe me an explanation today." She looked at him, surprised. "I'll listen whenever you're ready." Grace reached for Naomi's hand. "Can we go home?" Naomi nodded. Yes, the ride back to Cedar Wash Ranch was quieter than the journey that had first brought Naomi there. The mountains seemed farther away, the evening colder. After supper, Luke carried water to the horses, while Naomi folded Grace's clean dress onto the chair beside the little bed. Grace climbed beneath her quilt, but did not fall asleep. She watched Naomi pack the same weathered suitcase she had carried from the train. One dress, one Bible, a hairbrush. The blue ribbon Grace had insisted she keep. "What are you doing?" the little girl whispered. Naomi stopped folding. "If I leave..." Your father won't have trouble because of me." Grace threw back the blanket and hurried across the room. She wrapped both arms around Naomi before the suitcase could be closed. Her small voice trembled. "If you go," she looked up through tears, "I won't call anyone Mama anymore." Naomi's hands slowly left the suitcase. Instead, they rested gently around the little girl who refused to let go. Outside the bedroom door, Luke stood in the hallway. He had heard every word. He closed his eyes for a moment, but did not interrupt. Some silences deserved to finish before anyone tried to answer them. Luke spent most of that night on the porch. The lantern beside the front door burned low, throwing a circle of pale light across the worn floorboards. A coffee cup rested untouched beside him. Coyotes called somewhere beyond the ridge, and the wind carried the dry scent of cedar through the yard. Before sunrise, Naomi quietly closed the old suitcase. She left a folded note on the kitchen table beside the biscuit tin. "Thank you for giving me a place where Grace could smile." She slipped out before anyone woke. The only sound was the wagon hired from the stage stop, rolling toward the mountain road. When Luke found the note, he read it twice. Then he reached for his hat. Old Ben Carter was already feeding his mule when Luke rode into his yard. "I figured you'd come," the old rancher said. "You know something." Old Ben nodded. "I remember a conversation from years back. A widow named Ruth Brooks bought 40 acres near Red Spring. Folks said there was a year-round water source under that land." Luke frowned. Naomi's mother. I always believed so. Within the hour, they were riding together toward Judge Elias Mercer's office, a modest brick building beside the county records room in Ash Fork. Dust coated the porch steps. Inside, shelves bowed beneath leather-bound ledgers. Judge Mercer adjusted his spectacles and disappeared into a back room. The search took nearly an hour. One ledger became 2, then 3. Finally, the judge laid a faded file across the desk. "I've been looking for this document for years." Luke leaned closer. The deed carried Ruth Brooks's signature. Below it was a survey map showing a spring beneath the property. Another page followed, then another. Judge Mercer tapped the final document with one finger. This transfer was never legal. Luke read the name. Silas Boone. A forged guardianship. A false debt. A fraudulent transfer of management rights. Judge Mercer removed his glasses. Naomi never owed that man anything. Old Ben let out a slow breath. "I knew it." "The land was hers by inheritance," the judge continued. "If she leaves this territory without these papers, Boone will keep chasing her because the property is worth more than every head of cattle he owns." Luke carefully folded the documents. "I need certified copies. You'll have them." Outside, Luke mounted his horse without another word. "She's heading toward Black Canyon Pass," Old Ben called after him. "I'll bring Grace." Luke nodded once. Then he rode. The trail climbed through red stone and scrub oak before narrowing toward a wooden bridge stretched across a deep wash. Clouds gathered over the distant cliffs. By late afternoon, he spotted the hired wagon. Naomi sat inside with her suitcase resting beside her feet. Luke guided his horse into the middle of the bridge. The driver pulled the team to a stop. For a long moment, neither Luke nor Naomi spoke. Finally, she stepped down. "You shouldn't have followed me." "I wasn't following." He held out the folded documents. "I was bringing these." She looked at the papers but didn't reach for them. "What are they?" "The truth." Luke handed them over. She unfolded the first page. Her mother's signature. The survey. The judge's seal. Each page seemed to steal another breath. "My mother bought land that belonged to you." Naomi's hands trembled. Luke kept his voice steady. "You were never promised to Silas Boone." She closed her eyes. "I thought All these years. I know. A breeze crossed the bridge, stirring loose strands of her hair. Luke took one slow step forward. I'm not asking you to come back because I need help around the ranch. She looked at him. I'm asking you to make your own choice. He paused. If you stay, let it be because you choose to stay. Another quiet moment passed. And if you leave, he continued, I'll still stand beside you until every one of these papers is honored. Naomi searched his face. There was no bargain in his eyes, no demand, no expectation, only patience. Hoofbeats echoed from the trail behind them. Grace appeared on old Ben's mule, holding tightly to the saddle horn. The moment the mule stopped, she climbed down and ran. Naomi knelt just in time to catch her. I thought I lost you, Grace whispered, burying her face against Naomi's shoulder. Naomi closed her eyes. Her suitcase slipped from her hand onto the weathered planks of the bridge. She held the little girl with both arms. When she finally looked up at Luke, the fear that had followed her since Missouri no longer stood alone. Something quieter stood beside it, something that looked very much like trust. She picked up the deed instead of the suitcase. I'd like to go home. Luke didn't answer right away. He simply walked beside her as they turned back toward the ranch, leaving the empty road behind while the evening sun painted the red cliffs in shades of copper and gold. The days that followed moved quietly, but word traveled faster than any wagon. By the weekend, nearly everyone in Dry Mesa had heard that Naomi Brooks had returned to Cedar Wash Ranch. Some called it courage. Others called it foolishness. Luke ignored both. On the morning of the county cattle market, he hitched the wagon before sunrise. Naomi buttoned Grace's coat against the cool desert air and tucked a small comb into the little girl's pocket. You'll need this before church tomorrow, she said. Grace smiled. I'll remember. The livestock grounds were already crowded when they arrived. Ranchers inspected cattle behind split-rail pens. Auction clerks carried ledgers from table to table. Fresh coffee steamed from enamel mugs outside the cafe, while the smell of leather, hay, and dust filled the square. Marshal Owen Briggs stood near the courthouse steps with 2 deputies. Reverend Amos Bell greeted families as they arrived. Judge Elias Mercer unfolded a portable writing desk beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree. Then another rider entered town. Silas Boone. He dismounted without hurry, carrying the same leather folder beneath his arm. I've come to settle unfinished business, he announced. The conversations around the square faded. Silas walked straight toward the judge. I ask this court to recognize my lawful claim. Judge Mercer accepted the papers without expression. Then Luke stepped forward. He placed another folder onto the table. Certified copies, original deeds, survey maps. The judge examined each page carefully. The silence stretched until even the horses seemed to stand still. Finally, Judge Mercer removed his spectacles. Mr. Boone. His voice carried across the square. These documents prove the transfer of Miss Brooks's inheritance was fraudulent. He lifted the original deed. The property belongs to Naomi Brooks. He reached for another page. The guardianship presented by Mr. Boone was forged. Then he looked directly at Naomi. You are a free woman under the law. No debt binds you. No contract gives another person authority over your life. A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Mrs. Edith Collins lowered her eyes. Old Ben Carter smiled beneath the brim of his hat. Silas's face darkened. You're making a mistake. Judge Mercer calmly folded the documents. The only mistake was believing forged papers would stand forever. Silas's temper finally broke. He reached toward the revolver at his side. Before his hand could clear the holster, Luke stepped between him and Naomi. Enough. The movement lasted only seconds. Marshal Briggs and his deputies closed the distance immediately. "Don't do it, Boone," the marshal warned. Silas hesitated. Then, in one reckless motion, he drew. Luke reacted on instinct. A single shot echoed across the square. Silas's revolver spun from his hand and landed several feet away in the dust. He stared at his empty fingers in disbelief. Marshal Briggs secured him before another shot could be fired. "It's over," the marshal said firmly as the deputies led Silas away. No one cheered. The town simply watched until the sound of hoofbeats disappeared beyond the jail. The wind carried away the last of the gun smoke. Luke turned toward Naomi. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he asked quietly, "Where do you want to live?" There was no proposal, no demand, no expectation, only one honest question. Naomi looked at the folded deed still resting on the judge's table. She looked toward the distant hills that now belonged to her. Then she looked at Grace. The little girl reached for both of their hands at once. Naomi smiled through eyes bright with tears. "Where she calls me Mama." Grace hugged her so tightly that Naomi laughed for the first time since arriving in Arizona. Several months passed. Winter rains filled the spring on Naomi's land, and fresh grass spread across the valley below the red cliffs. The cattle grazed farther than they ever had before. A new wooden sign stood beside the ranch gate, Harper and Brooks Ranch. Luke left the old carved board bearing his late wife's family name hanging inside the barn, clean and carefully preserved. Some memories were not meant to be erased. They were meant to be honored. On a cool evening near the end of the season, the three of them sat together on the porch. Grace fell asleep with her head resting against Naomi's shoulder, the old cloth rabbit still tucked beneath one arm. Without saying a word, Luke unfolded a wool blanket and gently covered them both. Naomi looked up. Their eyes met. No promises needed to be spoken. The cottonwood leaves whispered overhead as the last light settled across the Arizona hills. The house no longer felt borrowed. The future no longer felt uncertain. It was simply home, and in that quiet place, surrounded by red earth, wide skies, and people who had chosen one another freely, they discovered that the strongest families were never built by contracts or fear. They were built one small act of trust at a time. Now, take a quiet moment and imagine yourself standing on that old wooden porch as the sun slips behind the Arizona hills. Imagine carrying years of grief like Luke, or living with the fear of never truly belonging like Naomi. Then picture a child reaching for your hand, asking for nothing more than love that stays. Maybe life has placed you on a road you never planned to travel. Maybe you've wondered if home is a place, a person, or simply the moment someone chooses to stand beside you without asking you to become someone else first. Stories like this remind us that healing rarely arrives all at once. It comes through patient kindness, honest choices, and the courage to trust again after life has given us every reason not to. If this journey stayed with you, I'd love to know what touched your heart the most. Share your thoughts in the comments, because someone reading them may find the encouragement they need today. And if these quiet Western stories of hope, family, and enduring love feel like a place you can return to after a long day, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more trails to follow, many more lives to discover, and many more hearts waiting to find their way home beneath the same wide Western sky.